Welcome to chapters 4 and 5 for the human biology students. In these two chapters, the author basically covers in the book the skeleton, the bones, what they're made out of, what they look like under a microscope, general histological and gross anatomical appearance. And then in the next chapter goes over the different types of muscles and what they're about in terms of their function and structure. Now, for that chapter 6 that talks about the muscles, we're actually going to focus only on the skeletal muscles. And this is because we will talk about cardiac muscle, which is the heart, separately later on. And we did already talk about the smooth muscle a little bit, and we'll come back to that later also in the semester. Now, for the structure and function of bones, keep in mind bones as part of the skeleton have multiple different purposes in the body. One is to provide leverage for muscles for movement. Another is that bones such as the skull protect soft tissues like the brain, the organs like the ribs or the rib cage, and the thoracic organs inside. Bones deep inside also contain bone marrow, which is essential for production of blood cells, and also have other functions as well that we will mention. Now keep in mind, when we think of bone, now you can take a look in the illustrations in the book. Essentially, the surface of the bone is covered by external tissue called the periosteum, which contains lots of blood vessels and is essential to survival of the bone. Once you remove that, you see the outer bone, which is the compact bone, also called cortical bone. That's the hard, rigid bone that we all know and familiar with. And deep inside would be the softer, spongy bone. And inside these kind of crevices or spaces of the spongy bone, we can actually see the bone marrow. The bone marrow overall consists of either yellow bone marrow, which is fat predominantly, or red bone marrow, which is actually the most important component critical for the production of red blood cells, white blood cells, and all the lineages of the blood cells in our body. Okay, so blood, again, originates deep inside in the bone marrow, in the red bone marrow specifically, especially the larger bones in the body, such as in the pelvis and the femur, other areas, contain quite significant amount of red bone marrow, and that allows us to produce cells for the blood. Now again, when you look at bone, the outer part of the bone covered by periosteum, that bone is the compact bone, deep inside it is a spongy bone. Okay, so fairly simple kind of overall view of it. You can see all these components under a microscope, and we'll see that in histology images. Now, when you look at a typical bone, let's say a bone from the leg, like the femur, you can see, or with other bones, obviously, the femur is just sort of an easier example to use, or other long bones like in the arms. The shaft of the bone is the diaphysis, and on each end where the joints are the epiphysis. Microscopically, we can identify the bone has multiple different types of osteocytes or living bone cells, and the predominant two types of cells there are the osteoblasts and osteoclasts. The osteoblasts are those cells that actually build the bone, that create the bone, that put all the minerals and collagen and other components together to make the bone what it is. Right? So very important during the growth of the skeleton during early years, and actually not just during childhood when you're growing and becoming taller and bigger, but also throughout your life when your skeleton gets remodeled, or after, such as something like a traumatic event like a bone fracture, osteoblasts are very active. But because we don't want to just constantly be building our bone, we also have to sometimes remove some of the bone, right? We have to balance out these processes. Remember, homeostasis, the balancing of all functions, is absolutely essential in the body. And so we have another type of bone cell called the osteoclast. An osteoclast is actually a cell that has the digestive enzymes to remove the minerals, remove the collagen from the bone, remove that calcium, right, that we know is stored in the bone, and basically break it down, right? So when we need to build the bone, we use osteoblasts to build the bone. We need to kind of destroy the bone or partially remove some of the bone, we use osteoclasts. Okay, so they work together, obviously, and we don't want too much activity from one or the other, right? We need to have them in balance to create the normal skeleton that we have and the normal physiological state that we need to survive. One important component here is to remember that bone consists essentially of, again, like I said, collagen. That's the natural kind of protein that we create in connective tissue, but also there's quite a lot of calcium there. Calcium is not found in ionized state in the bone, so it's not calcium 2+, it's not that electrolyte. It's actually found as calcium hydroxyapatite, so bound to a special molecule there in the bone, and that makes better use of the calcium and properly kind of stores it in the bone. And when the body needs calcium anywhere in the body, then that calcium can be cleaved off of this molecule and placed into the bloodstream to travel to the target tissue, wherever that needs to be. Okay. Now, when we look at the skeleton, again, we already looked at the skeleton in the lab component, but basically, remember, right, so the skeleton consists of over 200 bones in the body of different shapes, sizes, different appearances. In those areas where we have joints, we often have ligaments that connect bone to stabilize that joint, to make sure that it's able to do its job properly. And keeping in mind that obviously in the natural body, right, we have the skeletal muscles attached to the bones. In those areas where the muscle attaches to the bones, we have the tendons. Tendons and ligaments appear very similar. Essentially, they are connective tissue connections made of collagen that if it's a ligament, it connects bone to bone. If it's a tendon, it's the connection between muscle and bone. Okay, and obviously we do that to provide, again, to make sure that the muscles can actually move the bones, right, to provide that leverage, like we said, and allow for the musculoskeletal system to function properly. Any area in the body, in the skeleton, where we have two bones coming together, at least two bones, right, we call that a joint. Most of the joints in the body are very flexible, right, like joints in your fingers, in your elbows, shoulders, hips, and knees. And these are called synovial joints. This is the broad category. In the synovial joint, we have some liquid there. We have a synovial capsule. We have other components there to protect that entity, to make sure that there is reduced friction there for better flexibility, for better health of the joint. But there's also some locations, such as the sutures in your skull, where bones have merged together but do not move anymore. And these are called either sutures or immovable joints. They're also found in some other locations, but the most common ones you should be thinking of usually is in the skull, okay, like the coronal suture, sagittal suture, and others, if you remember from the lab. Basically, again, most of the joints you'll see in the body will be the flexible joints, synovial ones, those that do not move, like sutures or immovable joints. Now, there's also different shapes that bones have, right? So we call the shape of the bone based on its general overall appearance. So like when you see that bone, the first thing that strikes you about it is saying, okay, it looks like it's a long bone, or it looks like it's that kind of bone. So examples, for instance, I'll give you one example. For each one of these, this is the ones you have to know. You're welcome to obviously memorize other examples if you want, looking at the skeleton, taking a look at the book in this chapter. So long bones, for instance, something like the femur or the tibia in the leg, right? These are long bones. The little bones here in your fingers, individual ones, and the phalanges, these are actually also long bones. Short bones are the little stubby bones, like the wrist bones, the carpal bones here. Remember, we have 8 carpal bones in each wrist. Okay, those bones are short type of bones by shape. I have flat bones, right? Some of the bones in the pelvis, or like the clavicle, the collarbone, or such as the scapula in the back. These would be flat bones, because flatness, right, is its overall kind of appearance, its shape. And we have irregular type of bones. And this best example would be a vertebra, those bones in the back that protect the spinal cord and the spine, right, and go through that whole vertebral column. Okay, so like we have the cervical vertebra, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, right, all the way down to the coccyx or the tailbone. Okay, so the vertebral bones, these are the irregular shaped bones. Kind of a miscellaneous category, okay, I guess you can find other irregular bones as well. But the vertebra would be the best example. Keep in mind also, right, so as we talked about the joints and these specific areas, primarily for the vertebra, between each vertebra, right, there's these cushions. These are the intervertebral discs. They contain fibrocartilage, a specific type of cartilage that allows us to withstand the weight of the body, right, to kind of allow the spinal column to have that specific configuration and make sure, right, that your bones, right, the body's not like crushing everything together, right? So those cushions are made of fibrocartilage, and they are part of the intervertebral discs located between each vertebra in the spine. Okay. Other things that we want to take a look at the skeleton also, again, besides all those things that we're seeing in the lab and today, is that what kind of movements the body is able to do. And there's many different ways to talk about this. Definitely take a look at the picture, right? If it's hard to visualize some of these components. So at every joint, certain movements become very commonplace. So for instance, the most common type of movement would be flexion and extension, right? So you can say, like, with your neck, you can flex your neck, you can extend your neck, right? You can flex your wrist, extend your wrist, right? You can do this pretty much with every joint. So that's very common. The less common movements like abduction, adduction, you can say with your fingers, you can abduct your fingers, you can adduct your fingers, right? So abduct, spread them, adduct, bring them back, right? You can move your arms. Moving arms away from the body would be abducting the arms, bring it back, adduct the arms. The same thing for us, but you can see this is somewhat limited by the different locations. And the last one, supination, pronation, would be primarily moving the hands. When you supinate, you, at the end of the movement, you let your palms face up, and pronate, let the palms face down. So supination, pronation, if you can see what I'm doing, right? Basic movements primarily should be done with your hands. You can technically, I guess, do it with other areas in the body, but the best way would be, I think, to remember the movement here, again, supination, pronation. And again, the most useful ones would be flexion, extension, abduction to some extent. There are others as well. You can see that in the book. Allows us to kind of understand how the different joints can work, what is the flexibility you might have, what is the limitation of different movements. For the next area here, the next chapter essentially, we have the skeletal muscle. Now this chapter is quite extensive. Again, the author talks about quite a lot of different material there. We are focusing only on the skeletal muscles and its normal physiology. So now this is one of the more difficult topics in anatomy. Again, hopefully, again, it will be clear after I talk about this and you see this in the book and you can look at the illustrations and everything. Do not worry about little molecular kind of details that they talk about. I'm giving you everything you need to know here in terms of the basic components and what actually goes on. Keep in mind, essentially, when you're looking at the skeletal muscle, these are long muscle fibers with lots of mitochondria, with striations, right? If you're able to magnify these striations, see that there's actually molecules inside the different proteins, those striations are what's called the sarcomere, right? Collection of proteins that allow contraction to occur. The main proteins, the contractile proteins that actually allow for the movement, the contraction of the muscle, right? Like flexing the bicep here, right? The muscle here, is the myosin and actin, right? These two proteins, the main components of the sarcomere, if they were not there, the muscle wouldn't be able to work, wouldn't be able to function. Now, how do we essentially allow these proteins to work? So before any of this can happen, we need to have a nerve, a special type of nerve called a motor neuron, to go to the muscle to send the electrochemical signal to know the muscle for it to contract, right? So the muscle knows that it needs to do something. When we have a nerve and muscle combined together, we call this neuromuscular junction, right? Kind of depicted here in a very simple schematic. Basically, this top portion, that's the axon of the nerve coming to the muscle. The lower portion, right, is the kind of the cell membrane of the muscle cell. So what happens here is essentially that electrochemical message, primarily of a neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, travels through the axon, reaches this area. Once it's released here, it binds to the receptors on the wall of the muscle cell. Once that receptor is activated, it actually causes electrical changes in the cell membrane, what we call action potential. So the sodium and potassium pump are activated. There's constant movements of these electrons back and forth. As you're doing this, you're changing the electrical state kind of the cell. In that sense, a deeper signal into the cell towards the sarcomere, where finally calcium is released and these proteins become active and they start moving. Now it sounds like it's a lot of steps, and it is, but everything, remember, happens essentially instantaneously. So when you like pick up an object, right, that's very fast movement. And let's say I'm saying like I want to pick something up, even though so many things need to happen, right? So again, I'm going to repeat this. First, the nerve must be there, right? The motor neuron sends the electrical signal. Again, acetylcholine is released, binds to the receptors, activates this action potential, this electrical activity in the muscle. That sends the signal deeper to release the calcium and cause the sarcomere to start moving, right? The myosin acting. Overall, that process is called excitation-contraction coupling. We need to have just the right amount of acetylcholine, not too much, not too little, to make sure that this is happening properly. If there is inadequate or excessive amounts of acetylcholine, that often results in muscle paralysis, at least temporarily, whether it's spastic paralysis or flaccid paralysis, or overall kind of destruction of this very sensitive, delicate kind of mechanism. But normally, obviously, most people, this is occurring properly all the time, and we have successful kind of function of the muscle. Now, to go just a little bit further, we have to understand there's actually two different types of muscle fibers we have in the body. And this is true pretty much for everyone, but this is, obviously, we're talking about human biology here, so I'm going to illustrate it for the human cells. We have slow twitch fibers, muscle fibers, and fast twitch muscle fibers. So let's see what they really are, okay, very quickly. Basically here, okay, so essentially when we're talking about slow twitch muscle fibers, this is a type 1 muscle fiber, or also called red muscle. Again, you can use either of these terms. You can call it slow twitch, you can call it type 1, you can call it red muscle. This is the one that has lots of mitochondria. I think this is the one that should be first coming to your mind when you're thinking of muscles, especially skeletal muscles. It stores lots of oxygen in myoglobin. Myoglobin is kind of hemoglobin, the molecule that holds oxygen inside the muscle in this case, right? Myo means muscle. It has lots of blood vessels, right? So we can see a little bit why it's red. Mitochondria gives it that redness. Blood vessels give it that redness, right? That kind of myoglobin. And this is the muscle fiber useful for steady activities like jogging, swimming, so on. Right? So in the body, no muscle fiber is separate, right? They're all kind of intermingled, mixed in together. So when you look at your bicep versus the muscles, let's say in the legs, others, it's not like bicep is all red muscle and that was all white. It's not like that, they're all intermixed. In other animals, it might be quite a bit different, but in humans, they're intermixed. So when you see them, you can only tell this under a microscope. When you look at the muscle by itself in gross anatomy, you actually usually cannot see that. This is a microscopic kind of a difference. But still, right, it's very relevant because they are helping us do kind of these somewhat different functions and different purposes. So again, when you think of steady activities, what are you using? Using slow twitch fibers. Now, when you have fast twitch muscle fibers, these are type 2 fibers or white muscle, and this is the one that breaks down ATP fast. ATP, remember, is adenosine triphosphate. That's the energy currency of the cell. These muscle fibers have lots of glycogen. That's the storage form of glucose, remember, just like we have in the liver. Obviously, source of energy, right? Carbohydrates. We have rapid, powerful contractions that are possible here. And this is useful really only for brief, high-intensity activities like lifting weights, right? Think about this. When you are lifting something, right, you might be doing this for a while, but you're not lifting weights the whole day, right? You're not picking up a super heavy object and holding it for hours, right? You do this briefly, then you run out of energy. You're able to do this because of this high-intensity activity. When you're doing something else that's more long-term, like swimming, like jogging, like doing those kind of activities, there, right, you're relying more on these slow twitch fibers, right, that rely more on oxygen stored here in blood vessels and less on glycogen and fast breakdown of ATP, right? I hope this makes sense. Again, take a look at illustrations and pictures in the book and the description that the author gives us to kind of summarize and kind of better understand how this functions. So the last part here, talking about the disorders, there's quite a number of these important disorders in both the muscular components and the skeletal components. So I took a few from each of these different chapters. You should be familiar with some of these from kind of daily life. And those are, if it's very new to you, obviously pay particular attention to this. In the book, the author discusses the same the same component, the same disorders that I'm talking about here. So the most common, one of the most common ones is osteoporosis. Essentially, what this means is that a person later in life, very often in women especially, have lower bone density, and so essentially suffer from increased risk of bone fractures, as bones are affected now by low levels of estrogen and essentially kind of lose their mass to some extent and become more fragile, more frail, and are more likely to break. You see, it's a very common condition. Again, it's not normal, it is pathology, obviously. There's certain treatments or medications now available, different tests to also determine to what extent of osteoporosis a person has. And fairly common condition, against reduced bone density. Another very common condition, arthritis. This is inflammation of the joints. Arthro refers to joints. Arthritis could be of many different varieties. A very common one is the osteoarthritis. This is the one that we don't know exactly what caused it, but there's some kind of irritation, inflammation in the joints throughout the body, and that causes some disability and obviously needs to be treated for many patients and needs to be taken care of. It's a chronic condition, kind of like osteoporosis. Another type of arthritis, gout arthritis, a little bit less common, but still is important. This is the one where there are deposits of uric acids, essentially crystals in the joints, and causes, again, those crystals cause irritation, inflammation of the joints. Again, we call this gout arthritis. It doesn't happen to every joint in the body, only certain joints usually are affected. Again, there's treatment available for this, and this is somewhat a chronic disorder as well. We also have more complex disorder, and more difficult to treat, like rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune type disorder that we might mention later on when we talk about autoimmune disorders. But basically, this is when excuse me, your immune system attacks your body essentially, and here specific target of this attack is actually, unfortunately, the joints in the body. Rheumatoid arthritis, again, relatively, definitely much less common than the previous ones, but relatively kind of common as well. Kind of more complex to treat because it's deals with the immune system. And another type that could be quite severe is the septic arthritis, basically infectious type of arthritis, where there's actually bacterial or some other kind of infection that somehow got itself into the localized area of the joint and causes acute inflammation there. Again, of all of these, this is the only one that's true acute disorder predominantly, and definitely needs to be addressed right away and treated with antibiotics and aggressive treatment to make sure it doesn't cause destruction of the joint. Okay, again, the predominant one, the most common one, would be osteoarthritis of all of this. Muscular dystrophy, a very rare disorder, essentially a genetic disorder where a person inherits congenitally, essentially is born with mutations in important genes in the sarcomere, is no longer able to essentially, with time, kind of use their muscles, so become paralyzed, wheelchair bound. These patients have died at very young age. Years ago, now they survive a little bit longer with some treatment. But essentially, very complex, again, disorder that probably will need a gene therapy soon. Essentially, again, you're thinking about genetic mutations in a child born who has inherited this, right? This is a genetic disorder and causing either severe mutation, basically in the gene, or inability, basically, essentially, of those proteins in the sarcomere to function, so the muscles can no longer contract properly. And the last disorder that's going to be very important for us when we talk about this also in the lab, in infectious diseases, basically is tetanus. Tetanus, also called lockjaw. This is when a person, typical kind of picture is someone who has been walking, let's say, somewhere and steps on a rusty nail, and that nail goes into their foot. And there's bacteria in the soil called Clostridium tetani that releases toxins once it gets into the bloodstream of the person. and those toxins cause spastic paralysis, again, causing generalized muscle spasms, very severe, very painful disorder. Fortunately, again, we don't see this anymore that often, is because people are vaccinated against tetanus, right? Everyone receives vaccinations for it. Those, unfortunately, in some countries that either receive inadequate vaccinations or refuse vaccinations for whatever reason, even like here in the United States, they would be at a higher risk for this. Again, this disorder does not have some supportive treatment, but there's no antibiotic specific cure to just kind of get rid of this, because importantly, that even when bacteria has died, that has entered the body, it's the toxin there that causes the problems, right? So it's not like with other infections where you just kind of get rid of the bacteria and everything's gone. This becomes much more severe problematic, so it needs more complicated treatment. The best way essentially here is prevention with vaccinations. Again, make sure to review all this material in the textbook for chapters 5 and 6 on bones, skeleton, and skeletal muscles.